Move any items on this agenda?
Move to adopt.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion to adopt by Mrs. Drury, second by Mr. Laurenti. All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Any opposed? Okay, let's move on. We have our general public comment portion. This is the time for any member in the audience to discuss items currently not on today's agenda. Is there anyone out there? I do not have any speaker request forms for this particular portion. Okay, thank you. Now general public portion is now closed, and we're going to move on to our consent items. Today's consent items on the agenda are items 1 through 9, and let's open this up to public comment. Items 1 through 9, anyone in the audience wishing to speak? Seeing none, we'll move along and closing public comment. Are there any committee members that want to pull any items on today's agenda?
I do.
Okay.
I'd like to pull number 8.
Okay,
Thank you.
pulling number 8.
Fire's not good.
Okay. I'd welcome a motion to approve items 1 through 9 with the exception of item 8.
So moved.
Great, we have a motion by Mr. Laurenti and second by Mrs. Drury. All in favor?
Aye.
Great, motion passes. Let's address number 8. Mrs. Drury, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. And I see that the fire department has been a little busy today, so they're not here. Well, they were here earlier, but not here now. So I guess I would just like to make a comment that I have questions on this, on what the break-even point it would be, and if it's not a viable project, that we wouldn't renew it. If we don't make money off it, I guess, that we would not renew it after the 1-year trial period. Those would be my comments.
Any additional information?
So those are my questions, and they can also be answered probably Monday night. I yield.
Great, duly noted. Thank you, Mrs. Drury. Mr. Laurenti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and I just wanted to voice mine as well in case fire reviews this meeting for questions. Maybe somebody will say something to them so that they're ready Monday night, but my questions will pertain to increased costs, which is somewhat related to the previous speaker's comments, but are we buying additional vehicles to cover that area and those costs involved? So that will be the nature of my questions as well. I yield.
Okay, duly noted. Thank you, Mrs. Drury and Mr. Laurenti. I'd welcome a motion on this item.
I'd make a motion to
Okay.
send it to council without recommendation.
Second.
Okay, we have a motion by Mrs. Drury, second by Mrs. Modrick. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, motion passes. Okay, we are now at the end of the consent calendar. We're going to move to our non-consent items. Public comment is now open. I have 2 speaker request forms. Let's start with Diane Alberts. It looks like Mrs. Alberts would like to speak on items 13 and 14. Can you please come up to the podium? Welcome.
Thank you. Afternoon. Diane Alberts. I am an owner of 5th and Main Furniture on the corner of 5th and Main. And I also own the building with my partner, Jerry Freed, and life partner, Kay Alberts. Addressing the parking suggestions on the new ordinance changes, we would respectfully request 3 things. That the permit parking be delayed until we have a feel for how the dynamics will change versus what they're calling the periphery parking versus the metered parking, to get an idea of if it's going to work, because it's my understanding that we want to push it to the periphery so that there's more parking in the core. Okay, so being in the periphery but paying my downtown bid board dues as zone 1, I'm in the periphery right on the corner of 5th and Main, and I acknowledge that those people who are right on the edge are going to hurt the most. And it's not just us, it's everybody who's right on the edge. But I would respectfully ask that you give us a fighting chance. And the permit parking, we already have 200 permits out there that they're waiting for. Sarah Hansel responded to questions that we as business owners, we met about a week ago, and there's 20 questions, stating that the permit parking was being issued to accommodate minimum wage workers and part-time employees. Are you going to ask for their W-2s? How are you going to establish minimum wage? And those of us who pay for parking for their own employees, to the tune of 28 parking permits to the city, question this kind of logic when we already have 200 on the board. I didn't know we were subsidizing the parking. Okay? So that is a question mark I have. So asking that it just be not taken away, but just pushed back a bit. The other critical issue, in our opinion, is to delineate between paid parking in the metered areas and free parking all day Saturday in the periphery areas. Parking on Saturday is an issue for us every day, whether there's a parade, whether there's something on at Main Street Square, whether there's something at the VFW. And until we know how this parking works, and hopefully it does work and spreads this out the way you want it to, we're the ones who are getting the brunt of it, if you will. At least that's the way it would appear to me. And I don't see any other way to see it than that. If you have another way of explaining it to me, I would welcome that very much, because I can't see that there's any other answer but that. And I know that revenue is huge, but I have researched it, and aside from Deadwood, South Dakota, Rapid City will be the only people charging on Saturdays downtown for parking. You ask that it be simplified, that they understand where parking is, make it easy. Charge all of us, charge everybody, or charge no one on Saturday. Go either way. Enforce our 2-hour parking if necessary. But please don't allow people to park 24 hours on Saturday and Sunday in front of our store. We thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you for coming to speak with us. Please stay tuned. And Mr. Small. Thank you for being here.
Thanks for the opportunity. I'm essentially going to repeat what I said at the last Legal and Finance. Some points were just brought up that will affect my business too that I hadn't thought through to conclusion, but there's some really valid points in what you just said. My two biggest concerns with the proposal, and the only concerns I have, I'm in favor of the intent. I think this has the potential to achieve the desired outcome that the parking group is trying to get. My concerns, though, are the fine. $25 is a fairly substantial increase. I understand from reading some emails that there's conversation that would be reduced to 15. I would go even farther. As much of a radical change as this is to our downtown parking, could we not leave it the same for a little while and get our feet wet, let people get accustomed to the entirely new parking structure? I mean, virtually nothing is going to stay the same as it is now. There's going to be a learning curve for customers to adapt to what we're asking them to do. And then again, I have concerns about the limiting factor of 2-hour peripheral parking if a customer to downtown cannot find a metered spot at a reasonable distance from where they want to go. We want them to come downtown, stay, shop as long as they possibly can. And for the first 700 people, there will be 700 meters. Outside of those 700 vehicles, however many people they have in those cars, we're basically telling everybody else, you're on the clock. You have 2 hours, which includes your walk time, to get to where you're going, to eat, to wait to be seated, to do whatever. That really does limit it. 3 hours is more reasonable, and I also feel that with the extended enforcement hours, the 3 hours will work more in line with what the intent of the parking proposal is. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Looks like public comment is now closed. We're going to move over to our non-consent, number 10. Under our Finance Department, we have an introduction and first reading of ordinance number 6327, an ordinance regarding supplemental appropriation number 3 for 2019.
Motion to approve.
I have a motion to approve by Mr. Laurenti, second by Mrs. Drury. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. And now under our City Attorney's Office, item number 11, we have an introduction and first reading of ordinance number 6325, an ordinance to amend section 9.28.030 and repeal section 9.28.040 of the Rapid City Municipal Code relating to firearms. Any discussion? Mr. Laurenti, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair, and I just would like to ask the city attorney a question here.
Ed?
Joel, on this particular item, I just want to make sure that it basically repeals any limitations by the municipality in regards to the carrying of firearms. And does it do that? Or,
Yes.
very good.
Yep, Kinsley Grote with the City Attorney's Office. So limitations put on by the state, is that what you're talking about with the recent legislation?
Yes.
Yes, it does.
So do we have today, does the city have any limitations still in code? I should say, after this is approved, will there be any municipal limitations?
Not ones that will be against state statute. So,
Okay.
there were some exceptions in the recent legislation that allowed for some zoning stuff or some other maybe public safety issues. But this will clear it up. We will be compliant with state statute.
Okay, so will you be here Monday night?
I can be, yes.
Because my question is, I would like to honestly know the situations where the city is putting limitations, and when and how and why, what the reasoning is behind that. It's probably a question I should have asked a long time ago, but I'd like to know in what situations the city deems the ability to make limitations.
So just some past history on our ordinances, is that kind of what you're wanting?
Yeah, and what will still be in place after this is passed.
Okay, sure.
So
Yeah.
just, if you could,
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
yield. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'd welcome a motion.
Move to approve.
Second.
I have a motion to approve by Mrs. Drury, second by Mr. Laurenti. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, motion carries. Let's move to item 11, an introduction and first reading of ordinance number 6328, an ordinance amending section 5.12.080 and adding section 12.20.110 of the Rapid City Municipal Code regarding the consumption, mixing, or possession of alcoholic beverages in public places. Any discussion? I'd welcome a motion.
Move to approve.
Okay, we have a motion to approve by Mr. Laurenti, second by Mrs. Modrick. All in favor? Aye. Motion carries. All right, moving to number 13, we have a second reading and recommendation of ordinance number 6321, an ordinance allowing the installation of parking meters and revising the existing time zones in downtown Rapid City by amending Chapter 10.44 of the Rapid City Municipal Code. Mrs. Modrick, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. May I ask Joel and Dean a question?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Joel, on the two ordinances that we have before us on second reading, 13 and 14, I'm happy to see that the resolution is now 15, but my question to you in moving this ordinance forward, both of these ordinances into second reading to City Council, is that some of the points that were made by our business owners and property owners, as well as another meeting we have, public meeting tomorrow night, does it have any effect on the second reading of 13 and 14, or does this just allow us to move forward and be able to take in the public comments of tomorrow night so that they're updated on the Monday night meeting, since we have a public meeting tomorrow night on this?
Well, The resolution you can amend on Monday night. Now, if you make significant amendments to the ordinance that change the intent of the ordinance, then you would potentially have to continue second reading on Monday night, and that's going to be a matter of what gets approved. You know, one of the issues that we've dealt with this ordinance is we tried to be upfront, so we have attached what the policies are. Most of the concerns seem to be with the specific policies regarding the implementation of the ordinance rather than with the language of the ordinance itself. Now, on the one hand, you know, if you approve the ordinance, do not have direct say in a lot of these policies, because changing things then becomes cumbersome and takes a lot of time. As I've said, just because you're not part of that doesn't mean you can direct us on policy, but I would caution you to be very careful before you try to micromanage the parking, because having everything, there is a very specific reason, a lesson learned why we took all of these regulations out of the parking ordinance. And if you look at other communities, a lot of this stuff isn't in the parking ordinance. Now, some of it in other communities is, but I think relying on the parking committee and at least giving the recommendations of our consultant a chance to see if they can work before we start tinkering with them, I think would be a good idea generally.
And I value the opinion on that, but I also want to state my concerns in the way the new ordinance is written with the commission, a body that will be selected to manage this. Right now, we've been managed by staff, including yourself, which has been a really clunky way of managing parking. And we're in charge of policies and rates and charges. It comes before us in resolution mode, and we need to be the voices of those that have concerns on those rates and charges. Had we not been a voice a couple of weeks ago, we wouldn't have the business owners and property owners that are being affected by the change coming before us now and having another public meeting tomorrow night. So it's been important that it comes before the council and the conversations are open, discussed, and that there's public comment, and luckily we are getting that now. So I need to make sure that if we're going forward with our ordinance that has a piece of the council's job of policies and rates and charges, that we're not having an exclusion of city council because we are the voice of the people. And how would that be addressed once these two recommendations on these ordinances go forward? How will it come back to us? Only through commission or committee?
Well, if there's recommendations, yes, that involve an ordinance change, it would come back to you. Frankly, if you have constituents coming to you, you could add an item to the agenda to discuss it. But it isn't going to automatically come back to you. You're not going to be involved in the day-to-day management of the downtown parking because...
Yeah, and I think that is important. I mean, we're not in the job of the day-to-day management of the city either, but we are certainly putting in the hours so that we're the process and due process, and it's important. So we want to make sure that we're not excluding the council job, which is the connection of the people. That's very, very important. I did see, I think it was the first ordinance reading on 13, it does have city council listed in there. That's important to have it there, but we need to have the communication from the commission as well, or the committee, whoever is formed on that. That's important to me. It's why I see this as maybe we're rushing an ordinance that maybe still needs some work on it, and I'm still in reservations of that. But thank you for those answers.
Some great points, Mrs. Modrick. Thank you. Mrs. Drury, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. May I ask Sarah Hansen a couple questions, please?
Absolutely.
Sarah? I'll just list these off, and so for one, I would like to know how long you have been working on this new parking plan, or how long ago it started, because I know it started before I was on the council. I would like to know, can citizens, if a citizen has a concern, can they go to this new board and express their concerns? And then I was wondering if you could publicly answer Ms. Alberts and Mr. Small's concerns. 4 things.
Taking notes.
If you forget one of them, I have a cheat sheet up here.
Sounds good, thank you. Yes, how long have we been developing this plan? The downtown master plan was adopted in 2016, and we had over a year of study and public engagement. One of the major concerns coming from the downtown community and the city as a whole was, look at downtown parking. Downtown parking needs to be addressed. So even back then, we had over 1,000 people participating in that study in 2016. In 2017, we contracted with Walker Parking Consultants. They're a nationwide consulting firm, and we had over a year of study and public input to develop the plan and recommendations. Throughout 2018, staff and the advisory board that's currently serving has been sort of building on those recommendations, figuring out how to get them across the finish line, making tweaks where they need to be made along the way. So we've been working on it for 2 years directly, 3 years indirectly. And I would say beyond that as well, there was a parking study created in about a decade ago that has some very similar recommendations. 2007, thank you. And then number 2, can citizens go to the board? Yes, these meetings would be open to the public if someone wants to come and talk about the conditions that they're experiencing on their street, have issues, have concerns, want to understand the occupancy data that we're collecting in those areas. They will be open to the public. And to address the concerns, if I could just loop those 2 issues in with what the council asked us to look at. After first hearing, there were some specific things that you asked we look at. One, the violation fee of $25. We did look at that, the fee resolution before you today, which, just to clarify, Lisa, that is set by resolution, so that would, any change to that price would always come back to council, as would the parking meter rate of $1 is also established in that fee. So we did look at that, and it's coming forward at a reduced rate. I guess I'll just harken back to what we had talked about before, which was that the main purpose of a fine like that is to affect behavior. So we will, if it doesn't affect behavior, it wouldn't stay at 15, but we've brought it forward that way for now. Number 2, the time zone limits, 2-hour versus 3-hour. That's what's recommended in the plan based on kind of best practices for managing time-limited areas. We have been in contact with the consultant since that time just to kind of recheck in on it a year later, and they reiterated that if you have more than 2 hours, it's just very difficult to prevent long-term parkers who should be using an off-street asset where they can from abusing that. And I want to turn to Lieutenant Bach and Jim Gilbert, our IT director, as well, to shed a little bit more light on that information. And we have some data from our current parking management that we can look at as well. So go ahead.
So as part of the pilot for the I should introduce myself, but Lieutenant Bach with Rapid City Police Department, I manage the parking staff. So through the pilot program for the smart meters, Vigilant Solutions is partnered with one of the companies, and they're an electronic chalking company. And so we piloted that software back in September, and it was very successful and reduced parking staff's time with manually chalking tires. And the cost of that software was fairly reasonable, so we purchased that software at that time and have been using it to a limited ability, trying to get used to it and utilize it since September. So we did pull some data from that software, and Jim Gilbert was able to analyze a little bit of that data to tell us not only Walker Consultants did exactly the same thing, but they did it in one day in July. So we have 9 months of data. Like I said, it's not been used every single day, and we use that vehicle for a lot other purposes, so now we need a second vehicle. So some other things came out of that, but we do have some data in the last 9 months of plates collected in the Rapid City area, and I'll let Jim speak on what he was able to get from that.
So the Jim Gilbert, Director of IT, the data that we get is really just a picture of a license plate. And we did scrub a little bit of the early on September data because there were some issues with the way the South Dakota plates look the camera was having. So we went with actual identifiable dates and actual identifiable plates. So we probably threw out around 5,000 plates just because we weren't clear when they were first starting out in September. So about the first 3 weeks of September, we didn't use that data. Of the rest of the data, we have 147 days of times when that vehicle went out and scanned plates. During that time, we have approximately 45,000 unique plates in the system. So there were 45,000 times when a unique plate was entered into that system. When we look at that data, it really comes down to a question of how you define frequent parking downtown. If we define data, or if we define people who are downtown frequently as 25% of those 147 days, it's 80 plates. So the data for high frequency number of days downtown, 80 unique plates. If we expand that out to say we need 20%, so let's call frequent 20% or higher of those days, it's only 195. So really what the data is showing us is that a lot of the people that are parking downtown are parking for a very small percentage of those 147 days. They come downtown and they shop, or they come downtown and they go to dinner. It is a small percentage. The problem is that even at 195 cars, when you're only talking about 500 to 700 of the core spaces, that's a large portion of our core spaces. So that's why this process has started. In addition, when we looked at the data, and we looked at, there's one, we don't have hard data in terms of the car went out every day at 9, or the car went out every day at 10. So when we average the number of scans that were done in a day, and we look at that over the course of the period that we have data, we can make an estimate that says, that shows the average period of time that any one particular car, if we look across the data, is approximately 1.7 hours downtown, based on the number of scans that we have. So we can say that on average, when you look at all 45,000 plates, we're talking about a 1.7 to 1.8 hours that they stay in the downtown area. When you look more specifically at the cars that are downtown a lot, those first 80 or first 195, then that goes up to 2.6 to 2.8 hours, or 2.8 scans in a given day. So that's about 4 to 6 hours in a given day. So we have high frequency, high time, we have low frequency, low time. And there's a lot more on the other end of the spectrum than there is on the repeat people that come, that park every day and stay for a very long time. The shufflers, if we want to call them that. So that's the data that we were able to glean from the license plate recognition software.
I have one more question.
Please go ahead.
And then I'll yield the floor. A couple times it's been brought up about, let's not implement this now, let's test it for 3 or 6 months and then implement it later. What do you think about that? I mean, to me that seems almost more confusing than changing it, but I don't know.
If we could, I think that would be something to try. However, I don't think we can, and here's why. We know that many employees who park downtown have hang tags. They have a place to go when they can't shuffle conveniently and get away with it anymore, and that's great. All those people who have spots and leases are good. But there's anywhere from 100 to 200 people who are on wait lists for parking lots who don't have a place to go. So if we install the new meters, those employees, and it's a handful of them, we don't know exactly how many, if it's between 100 and 200, somewhere in there, what will their options be? Their options will be to plug a meter, which is not going to be affordable, get parking tickets every day, also not affordable and not good, or or all of those people are going to have to go find unmonitored areas, which is going to be really far to walk, and also concentrating all of those employees on a handful of block faces. So, I mean, if we didn't have to do the on-street permit, that would be ideal. I mean, in the ideal world, all employees would have an off-street place to go. That's not the case now, but fortunately for Rapid City, we do have some streets downtown that have a lot of excess capacity. So I mean, we understand the concerns about oversaturating employees on any given block face. That's what happens now. That's what we're trying to get away from. You know, no one can say that it's going to get out of the gate perfectly on day one, but we will have a lot more ability to understand the balance between employees and visitors on any given block face, whereas right now, we have no ability to do that. We have gridlock in certain areas.
And I appreciate the data from IT, because that's going to be extremely helpful for you. I have one, I lied, I have one more question, and then I will yield, I promise. For the fines, if the fine is $15, so if I go downtown and I park there and I just stay all day, is it $15 or is it $15 every time they come around and check my vehicle and that I'm over time?
I believe it'll be $15 every time they check your vehicle, but today was the first day that was discussed. That's the way it used to be enforced. But the question too is how many times they get around to it.
Okay.
I mean, I'm kind of flexible on that as far as should it be once per day or what. I mean, I think that's something that frankly we need to look at, because one of the reasons the staff has been flexible on the fines is fine. We'll go down to 15 rather than start it out to 25. And then if we think it needs that is not altering people's behavior, then hopefully we'll have the data to show that, and we come back to the parking committee and the council and ask you to reconsider it. You know, but I will just say, when you look at Mr. Small's concerns about the fine, we're going to be doing 11-hour enforcement proposed on the parking meters. So you could pay all day, it would cost you $11 at a meter. So if you have a $10 fine, it would be $1 cheaper to just get a ticket and pay a fine. So I don't think we can keep the fine the same as what it is. Right. So $15 in discussion was the cheapest we felt we could go to both be a deterrent and to financially make sense, so it didn't encourage people to have violations rather than pay the fee.
Officer Block, I see you moved up to the lectern. Did you have a comment on that?
I could just answer what we're doing today, and you'll see it was an ordinance that it said, I think during the time zones, you could get ticketed for every time zone violation. So that means in the 2 or 3 hour zone, we could come back every 3 hours, and if you're still there, give you another ticket. And that actually was put there because people wouldn't, I mean, they were basically utilizing our tickets as an all-day pass. So they were willing to pay $10 to park there all day. So we needed to de-incentivize that, and so we were able to give them another ticket, so you could get 2 tickets a day at $20. And whether that's an incentive or not, I can't tell you how many times people took advantage of that too, but that was it. I do not believe, and I'm not 100% positive, but I do not believe that we go back to a meter zone and re-ticket you, because it costs $0.25 an hour to park at a meter. It's $1.75 to park at a meter all day long. And just to speak a little bit on the long-term parkers, if you look at the map, and I don't think we have a map of the current parking in Rapid City, but if you look at the current map of the parking in Rapid City today, there are 10-hour meters, and they cost $1.25 an hour, which is $1.75 a day, which is about $45 a month if you're a full-time employee and feed that meter. And while we don't have data, because we don't have smart meters like we'll have in the future, I can tell you my parking staff will tell you that people are using those as long-term daily parking. Okay. So where you see the yellow zones up here, those are 10-hour meters. You can go to those locations, and if you work or frequent those areas, you can park there all day long. Apalda Street's a good example. I think there's there's not much business front on that street, and so those meters are plugged all day long by long-term parkers. Okay. So a meter, an on-street permit program is just officializing that.
Okay, I need to yield and let my fellow council people have a chance. Thank you, I yield. Thank you.
Stand by, I think you might be needed. Good information, great discussion. I'm going to bump to Steve Laurenti real quick. Mr. Laurenti.
Thank you, Chair. And I'm not going to beleaguer some of the other stuff because it goes right down the line of my own questions. So I think those were answered. But I just wanted to make a comment and hopefully allay some of the concerns, because I do feel for the furniture store on 5th and Main Street. And I had conversations with them at the last meeting, and fairly long comments. We talked outside after the meeting, but I just want to say that this is being set up in a way, and it's being based on tons of data, which is something this council has lacked for many, many, many years, because I've been on the council for many years. And so this ordinance, changing the ordinances, drawing the policies out of it, doesn't take the council out of the process. What it does is allows for a parking board to be able to react to the necessary changes to make parking successful downtown. That's the bottom line. I'm telling you that the current process does not work. It does not work at all. And in fact, unfortunately, what happens is, and I said this at the last meeting, is that the squeakiest wheels get the grease. That the council has made decisions based on very few voices who spoke very loudly about their displeasure with parking. And that is not how you manage something like downtown parking. Downtown parking should be based on some of the things we're already hearing and will continue to hear and be based on, which is data, long-term data, the gathering of thousands of data points from the habits of how people park in downtown Rapid City. Now, that doesn't mean that the council will be drawn out of it. Ultimately, the council could bring back the ordinance and put the policies back in the ordinance if they wanted to, if they had the votes for it. So the council's never going to be out of it. But I would I would caution my colleagues to have some patience with this, because it is a major change for council as well. And there's a lot of fear on council. But the reality is, I'm saying as a long-term councilman, that the current process is broken. It's broken. And if you've been on the council for any amount of time, you would know. We've had study after study on parking, and we've ignored every professional study that we've paid for. And it's time to make a change. It's the ideal definition, it's the absolute definition of insanity, expecting things to improve but continuing to do the same thing. So here we are introducing a new process based on real data and actual studies we've been paying for, and we have a board that is going to be able to make changes as we go along. It is the best way to manage parking, and we have to trust it. We have to trust it, one, because it's easy for me, because I know the current process is absolutely broken. So I know, and I'm a data guy, I've been in finance since 1996, and statistics, I'm a Six Sigma guy who has worked in that field, a highly statistical field. Data tells you everything you need to know. And data tells, there are emotions out there, I get it. But the reality is we need to make decisions on data, especially when it comes to something like this. And the nice part is the board will be able to make changes so that it works for Rapid City. Because I know that's what some people will say, well, we're Rapid City, we're not this town or that city. But the reality is that's why the board exists, so that the board can make competent, well-informed decisions based on data and the need for Rapid City. And we have to trust it. I yield.
Duly noted. Our city attorney's in the queue, been waiting. You have the floor.
Thanks. I want to maybe say a few things even stronger than staff already has as far as the permit. I think if you don't implement the permit at the same time as the meters, it's going to be a disaster. You have a bunch of people shuffling right now. This has really two primary purposes. There's a revenue side of it, to make sure that we're generating sufficient revenue to invest in our downtown parking and make sure that we're covering just our operational and maintenance costs, let alone some capital down the road maybe. But also to stop the shuffle and free up spots in the most desirable area along Main and St. Joe, so that when customers come downtown, they have a place to park. If you take all the shufflers now and you implement the piece of this that moves them off Main and St. Joe, and you don't give them somewhere else to go or some solution, that's what's going to create problems. The whole point of the permit was, okay, we're going to push these people off Main and St. Joe. They're going to go somewhere. So if you're a shuffler, and that's what you know, you're going to keep shuffling. And you're going to go to the blocks that are closest to Main and St. Joe. So you are going to inundate, because now there's no restrictions, so you're going to inundate blocks like Freed's. because it's the closest block. But if we're issuing permits and we only issue 2 permits for that, then you're not going to inundate the block. So the whole idea of the permit was to disperse that and more efficiently use our off-street resources in the periphery. But we recognize that if we just let it go without a permit process, we were going to have a free-for-all, and it was going to inundate the block faces closest to the core in the periphery. So again, if you don't implement the permit at the same time, you're going to end up with an even bigger problem than you're perceiving you're going to get with the permit. Saturday enforcement. I can understand where it's like, hey, it's not fair, either enforce it all or don't enforce it on anybody. But I guess the question I would ask all of you is turnover and parking important on Main and St. Joe on Saturday? If turnover and parking is important, then you need to enforce the meters. Otherwise, you're going to have, I mean, how long is it going to take the employees and residents to figure out that there's no enforcement on Saturday, and then they're going to be taking a lot of those spaces? Now, they may already be doing that, and maybe there's not enough, it's a problem. But if you believe that turnover and parking is important, then you would want to enforce the meters on Saturday. So what about the 2-hour zone? Maybe that makes sense in front of Freed's, but does it make sense to cite people on Kansas City Street when there's 1 or 2 cars on the block face for a 2-hour violation when there's only 2 cars? I mean, our data does not show that it's justified to enforce the 2-hour parking on the periphery. Now, maybe if we have a specific issue like with a Freed's or another close-in block face, then yeah, we're going to have to look at, I mean, I think there's a couple quick solutions. One would be loading zones. Another would be looking at the first expansion of the meters. I don't know that we'll need that. I mean, that's what we're all speculating right now, but that's probably the answer to it. The answer is not to not enforce on Saturday. That's going to have a revenue impact on what you're doing, and it's also going to be against the idea of getting turnover and parking. Final thing I want to touch on is the debate between the 2 or the 3 hours in the periphery. The 2-hour number isn't something that's just pulled out of thin air. Statistically, and you just heard the statistic that Rapid City isn't different than any other community, the basis for the 2 hours is that they've done studies time after time, and the average stay is less than 2 hours. So if you adopt a 2-hour, you capture a majority of the stays, a high percentage. You balance that, the more time you add, the more likely you encourage shuffling. So the concern that I would have is we're trying to address shuffling on Main and St. Joe. If we allow 3 hours in the periphery, are we potentially then just moving the shuffling problem to the periphery? It's going to be harder to shuffle because it's not going to be as convenient, but I also tend to believe people, hey, I'm a shuffler, this is how I've always done it. That's going to be their initial reaction. I go back to my initial statement that part of the goal of this is to change people's behavior. If we have a 2-hour and the fines go up, it's not going to make it conducive to shuffle. And now we have an alternative that's easier by getting a permit and assuming that our studies are correct based on our inventory. We should have enough inventory downtown to accommodate that without inundating any single block face. Then they have a viable alternative, because as someone who has to deal with parking violations, that's my frustration. When a cook from a restaurant comes in who's making minimum wage and says, where am I? I've gotten, and usually when they come in, they've gotten like 5 tickets and they've gotten their boot and it's like a $250 fine and they can't pay it. And they're upset. And they're like, where am I supposed to pay? Or where am I supposed to park? And I don't have an answer for them. Now I would have an answer for them. Get an off-street permit. Well, I don't want to walk 2 blocks. Well, that's your option, but at least it is an option. It may not be the option they want, but it is an option that they have. So I would be cautious to do anything that's potentially going to encourage it. And when you go back to talking about changing behavior, if you're a customer coming downtown to shop or eat or do whatever, you should park in the meters, because if you need 3 hours, you can get 3 hours. if you want to go park on Kansas City Street so you don't have to pay a meter, and you go for 3 hours, and you come back and you have a ticket, what is the response to that? Now, the naysayers will say, oh, they'll never come downtown again. Now, there might be that person that's so upset about it, they won't come down. My guess is next time, instead of parking on Kansas City Street, they're going to find a meter spot, they're going to pay for the 3 hours. We will have changed their behavior. That's the point. And I think, I was looking at this, towns like Casper, they get the same thing and same recommendation, different company, because these techniques work to change people's behaviors. They're tried and tested.
Thank you for expounding on those points, giving some examples. We do have 2 people in the queue. Ms. Modrick, brief if you could be, please.
Thank you. I'm not ever very brief. I will try out of respect for my chairwoman. I think the dialogue and the discussion is the discussion that we're having now as we're in crunch time for Monday night. I think we still need to take a look at this. I liked what Diane had stated about we can implement this process, but we could also do it with some kind of a form of moving this in. If we want to change behavior, we also need to work with that same behavior that we want to change. And what we're doing is, and this is why so many of the peripherals are coming at us now, is we're pushing the problem from the core to the outs. And are we really prepared for that problem? Because if we're shifting the problem, we haven't really solved the problem. The 3 hours, sure, for $3 for 3 hours in a paid parking, that could be reasonable. So you don't have the concern that you're going to get hit with a $15 or more penalty, but that doesn't work for the peripheral, which we're shifting the problem to, and that's why we need to listen to what is being stated by those that are going to be hit because they just missed the line, and yet we're calling the core here, but our core has grown. Our core now goes all the way towards West Boulevard and is now headed towards the campus at School of Mines. That's the direction we're headed in, and we've got a chunk of core that's been discussing with us how this is shifting that problem to them just because they missed it by a couple of parking spaces. So is that really fair? I think the solutions when a business owner comes and says, here's some things that I think could solve us until we move this forward, I think that's valid. I think we need to listen to our business owners when they say that. I also feel we may have other ideas that are going to come to us on May 2nd. There's a lot of people talking about this, sharing concerns, trying to work scenarios, and try to not be the problem as well when they come before us, but to actually bring solutions just like Diane did, just like Kurt is talking about as well. So I hope that we as a council will take into consideration what happens on Thursday night. That is a public meeting. It's a called public meeting, and it's going to be a valuable meeting because what we've got here is a really good plan. We just now need to make it fit into our growing core. And let's face it, back 10 years, 20 years ago, we didn't have the free internet, the free delivery that we have today. We need to make sure that we're also providing a competitive avenue for the businesses that are investing and staying here so that we can buy local and shop local and get our product today and keep that in mind. We don't want to see these receipts go down because we decided we were going to throw it all in and then we could take it back out in a committee formation. Let's make sure we don't affect their receipts. Let's move this correctly. Be careful of those blocks that are the growth blocks, that are the high sales tax, high generating blocks, and let's keep them involved in this too. The core has expanded. I hope we keep that in our minds too and that we expand with the core. Thank you.
Okay, some great points. And our finance officers in the queue. Ms. Assumption, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to also point out, I don't know that I've heard it mentioned today, but also on Saturdays, what will help alleviate some of that pressure on those periphery 2-hour zones if we're not enforcing, all of our leased lots are free. The ramp, the 2 floors on the ramp is free, the CSAC lot is free, 6th and St. Joe is free, the 7th Street, the 8th Street, the stock growers. We have all these lots that are open space for anybody that can come down. And So that's something also to keep in consideration. Not only are they free on the weekends, but they're free holidays and nights after 5 p.m.
Very good.
Thank you for that additional information. All right, so we're looking at item number 13. I'm sure this discussion will continue tomorrow at the meeting as well as to Monday. I would welcome a motion on item 13.
Move to approve.
Second.
We have a motion to approve by Mrs. Drury, second by Mr. Laurenti. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And
No.
one no. Mrs. Modrick, thank you. Thank you. All right, moving to item number 14. We have a second reading and recommendation of ordinance number 6324, an ordinance updating and revising the general parking regulations of the City of Rapid City by amending Chapter 10.40 of the Rapid City Municipal Code. I
Move to approve. Second.
We have a motion to approve by Mrs. Drury, a second by Mr. Laurenti. All in favor?
Aye.
Any denies?
Denied.
I had a feeling. Thank you, Mrs.
No.
Modrick. Okay, motion carries. And number 15, we have an approved resolution 2019-035, a resolution amending certain fees to be charged in 2019 for various licenses, permits, and applications.
Move to approve.
We have a motion to approve by Mr. Laurenti, second by Mrs. Drury. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
No.
One opposition. Mrs. Modrick. Thank you. I'd welcome a motion to adjourn.
Move to.
Okay, we have a motion to adjourn. All in favor?
Aye.
Great. And there is a city council meeting next week on Monday, May 6th at 6:30 p.m. in these chambers. I welcome the public to attend. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Lisa.
Conversation. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.